All right, so this last weekend, Kanye West and Ty Dolla dropped their long anticipated, you might say, follow up to the Vultures 1 project that came out earlier this year. Vultures 2, officially out as of last weekend on all streaming platforms. It's been undergoing a series of updates to the sound quality, to the mixing and mastering over the past few days, kind of being updated in real time as far as I'm aware. And we are going to dive in and review the project today. You will have to excuse my uh, co-host Jaden. He, unlike me, has a life outside of doing nonsensical things, so he will not be here today. But I'm going to go ahead and share my thoughts on the album here and kind of how it's sitting with me after the first couple of days. And to preface this, I will say, for anyone that hasn't heard our Vultures 1 review, which we did earlier this year, you can catch that on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. But it wasn't really an album that I loved. While I did see a lot of the merit in certain songs, I do definitely think it's one of Kanye's weakest projects, if not the weakest project that he's at least released on publishing or on streaming platforms. But Kanye in general is one of my favorite artists. I think his discography is one of my favorites in the hip hop genre. He is a one of the few artists that's been able to deliver consistency for the most part, up until relatively recently, I would say, throughout his career. And so I would definitely consider myself a fan of his music. But like I said, lately, not really all that much the same quality that he's had earlier in his career, at least in my opinion. But let's get into this thing because Vultures 2 starts off with the track Slide, um, giving us this kind of cinematic horror movie, throwback style instrumental, which is a pretty apt description of what we're going to get for the rest of the album because it is a horror show. And I say that only somewhat jokingly. There are a lot of bad elements to this album. There's a very few redemptive qualities. But to get more into specifics, we'll start off here with the production. Each of these categories we always rate out of 10. I personally would give the production a 6 on here because it is still the draw for this Kanye album. There are some moments that do well in terms of the beats, in terms of the sound styles that they're going for. The mixing and mastering has been improving, which is a good thing because originally and still on some tracks at this point, it is very poor, which I include in that production category. But despite this being the draw for Kanye's album still at this point, this album in particular rehashes a lot of lazy instrumental ideas that have been done better by other artists, including Kanye in the past. To me, it feels a lot like a poor man's Donda or the Life of Pablo, kind of maybe a blend between those two sound styles. And the mixing still does need some improvement, but at this point, I don't see that adding too much to this category. But like I said, there are some moments that I have a lot of respect for. I do think Slide is a cool instrumental, all jokes aside. There are some fun things that we've heard Kanye do before that still sound pretty cool. For one, I do think the instrumental style for Fried is still a pretty cool idea. Field Trip also has some cool beat moments as well. But moving into the vocals here, this is an aspect of Kanye's discography that I do feel like tends to be a little underrated. Unless you're a diehard Kanye fan, you may not recognize everything that he does vocally on the album and what that adds, despite it maybe not being his forte. However, on this project, I do think this is one of Kanye's weaker vocal performances in terms of an album, but that's not really where this category takes a major knock for me. It's more so in the flows. They're very lazy, they're very lackadaisical. And between those lazy flows and the vocal delivery flaws, it does do the album quite a bit of disservice. I feel like Kanye here, and Ty Dolla to be included in this for sure, as he's a massive part of this project, um, there's moments on the album where they're trying to convey emotion, they're trying to um, share um, vulnerabilities or challenges that they're going through. And a lot of times I feel like the lazy vocals or flows take away from that emotion that they're trying to convey, which is unfortunate because I know that they both are capable of doing that very well, that they have done that very well, even on relatively recent projects over the last 4 or 5 years. Um, but yeah, I don't think it's true failure necessarily is in the vocal range. I still think they showcase some decent range on the album, but it's more so in the lazy, nonchalant flows that aren't really innovative, aren't really doing anything original or fresh. It's just very standard cookie cutter flows across the beats in terms of their rapping performances, which will kind of take us into the lyrics here. And to wrap up that category, before we move on, of vocals, I did give that a 4 out of 10. It was a fairly weak aspect, certainly not the weakest, as you will see if you continue to follow along with this episode. Um, but I will say the lyrics I gave a 3. The only respite from the abysmal lyrical performances are these brief moments of vulnerability or random comedy bars that kind of make you chuckle a little bit. But those are so largely overshadowed throughout this album by um, raunchy and shallow content. And that's not to say that that's out of the norm for either of these artists, but it certainly takes away, especially considering the fact that there's not really any great lyrical displays that they are both capable of and have shown that they can do. There's not really any great lyrical moments. There's a few, like I said, funny ones or moments that convey some vulnerability, but they're overshadowed by just these ridiculous, raunchy, shallow bars that they continue to throw out back and forth, which knocks it down to a 3 for me. And that will kind of take us into the concept and theme of this album. Because the themes of excess and kind of getting blackballed from the music industry and from getting canceled in terms of what Kanye has been going through, those were a very prominent factor on Vultures 1 and continue to be so here on this second part of that series. But it does very little to explore any room for either artist's growth. Like I said, there's a few tracks and moments that portray some vulnerability, like 530, Sky City, Husband, among a few others. But the for this album, it's hard for those things to hold any weight or at least gain any sympathy for me personally when Kanye and Ty Dolla and the other featured artists are talking about women and human beings in general on this very project in the way that they do in several tracks in between. I think it's one thing to talk about these things early in the album or at various parts in the album and kind of show how this life of excess may not be doing them justice and how they're striving to get more towards these things that they're expressing vulnerability for, hoping for good things for their family and all of this. But it doesn't feel like that's the direction that they're taking on the album. They're really just here to say, look at how much we've got, look at all the women we have, and then, to say, oh, but feel bad for me because my life's hard too. I don't really think you can have it both ways for the most part. I think a lot of times on this album, it just comes across as thrown together. You also don't get a lot of great continuity from one track to another because there is some hodgepodging of various projects here, from new stuff that they're working on, from Donda 2 era songs, from throwback era Yandi music from 2018. It's a little bit all over the place, both in terms of content and in terms of sound, which ultimately also gives the concept a 3 for me, because I do feel like it's pretty weak. But then to move from the concept or the theme and talk about the features here, this is one of the aspects that I do feel like is one of the few positives on the album that has a lot of draw. For some reason, whatever it may be, Kanye generally is able to get the very best out of the artists that he works with. And I do think for a lot of the features on the project here, that does prove to be the case again, whether that's Kodak Black, Don Toliver, Young Thug, Lil Durk, Lil Baby, 070 Shake, and even Designer on the track Sky City. I think give some of their best recent performances, in my memory at least. They all sound really good. They add a lot of replay value to the album that lacks a lot of replay value on its own. We do get Northwest and Chicago West, Kanye's children, appearing on the track Bomb together, which is fun, but again, doesn't really add anything musically to the album, not really making it a track that I would come back to or that I think really has any enjoyability to it. And then we also get Future and Lil Wayne, who both sound okay, but I've heard both of them do much better stuff, even in the past year. And then to me, really the only weak feature, and this may get a little bit of hate, but I do feel like this is a pretty weak performance for Cardi on the track Field Trip. But generally, like I said, one of the few bright spots on the album. There is a lot of great feature material here. But we'll move into the last category here, which is enjoyment and replay value, which for me is a 2 out of 10. There's really not a whole lot of content on this album that I feel like I'm going to come back to. I will say personally, I did enjoy this project a bit more than Vultures one, which may be a hot take. I don't know. It does seem like, at least in terms of music reviewers or music personalities that are pretty well respected, I might say, they tend to say this album is far worse, and I don't know if that's prior to mixing and mastering improvements or what the case may be for them. But for me personally, I do feel like I enjoyed this album a little bit more than Vultures 1. And again, this may be controversial, but I think there are a few moments here that are reiterations of things Kanye's done on Vultures 1, but I personally enjoy them a little bit more. I think they're a little more well done. I think they're a little bit more that they take the music into a little bit better direction than he did on the previous project. For example, I think Fried, although it is a rehashed idea of that Carnival track that we got, it is one that I enjoy a little bit more than Carnival. For me, I think the over the top nature of Carnival went too far. I think the features didn't do very well. I think the chorus was outrageous and just ridiculous, and I didn't love it personally, but I do think this one is a little bit better version of that. But like I said, that could just be me and personal taste. But yeah, ultimately not a whole lot of replay value or enjoyment for me on this project. It is a pretty weak Kanye project. But to move on to kind of our last thing that we always do here with the best, worst, and most underrated tracks, I will say for me, I think the best track here is River, which features Young Thug. I think it's getting a little bit of love from fans and from the audience, but I don't think it's getting nearly as much as it probably deserves. Again, close one here between the best and most underrated track for me, because this was another one that I enjoyed quite a bit, is Sky City with Oso No Shake and Designer. Ultimately, to me, I think the worst track was probably Time Moving Slow. I do think it's a pretty weak point on the album lyrically, in terms of production, in terms of vocals. But those are the 3 tracks I have there. And really quickly, if you will bear with me, I forgot to total this album up and give it a round rating out of 10. So we will do that here really quickly if we can. And we have, let's see, one of the lower albums for sure that we've rated on this channel. It comes out to just above a 4 for me, which is pretty much how it feels like it's sitting. I don't feel like it's a great album. Certainly there's a few tracks that have some merit to them. but ultimately not one of Kanye's best projects, which is disappointing. But I will say I didn't really have all that high of hopes going into this album. So, anyways, if you guys have listened to this project, drop us a comment. Let me know what you thought of it. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my analysis here of the album. And as always, thanks for listening. And we will be back next week with another review.